of this conference. So before giving the floor to Alessandra, I just would like to thank on behalf of the organizers, Marco Manacorda, Guy Michael, Steve Matching, and myself, to really thank all the participants for agreeing to do this online. I mean, we may all agree that this is not a great substitute for doing it face-to-face, but we're very happy that this has gone ahead anyway, so thank you so much. Also, thank you to the two host institutions, the CPE and the CEPR. And huge thanks, of course, to Mariolina, who was behind the scene like throughout these 2 days and throughout the whole organization. So without her, we wouldn't have been all connected to this event. So thank you very much to you all. And now we are very, very pleased to have Alessandra Voena from Chicago giving the second keynote talk of this conference. So Alessandra, you really need no introduction to this audience. So she will talk about marriage, labor supply, and the dynamics of the social safety net. The floor is yours. You have 1 hour, and the house rules are usual. So you can interrupt during the talk and just unmute yourself and step in if you'd like to ask a question.
Well, thanks, Barbara, and thanks to all the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present my research, and I very much enjoyed this whole conference. And thanks for people who are willing to stick around on a Friday night at 6 p.m. This paper is joint work with Hamish Low, Costas, Meghir, and Luigi Pistaferri. We've been working on this for a while, so you may have seen earlier versions, but I would say that this version is quite renovated. so we have a fair amount of new material, so feedback is extremely welcome. Vast body of literature studying how households cope with income shocks. Tells us that the welfare system, that would be sort of the social safety net and the social insurance system, are important sources of consumption insurance. And that's when it comes to the United States, but not only, the social safety net in particular tends to target primarily single-headed households with dependent children. And so very often these will be in the United States, single mothers. So when you read about the debate about reforming the welfare system and the classic insurance incentive trade-offs, of course, is part of the discussion. And so both the policymakers and economists have discussed, of course, the role of social insurance in potentially influencing incentives to work. However, another area that is at least equally important is, particularly given, as we'll see, the design of many of these social insurance programs, is the debate regarding whether there may be incentives built into the welfare system to forming single-headed households, given that, as we'll see, the welfare system tends to be designed to treat basically households differently depending on their structure. And yet, despite the fact that these potential incentives might exist, or at least this interaction between household structure and welfare eligibility is very strong, most studies of welfare reform and welfare have focused on single mothers, which indeed are the primary recipient. But as we'll see, the system has strong interactions with the whole household structure. So studying transitions in and out of marriage, as well as how the welfare system might treat households of different structure differently, might be quite important for its design. So let me give you a sense of why this might be the case. I hope you should be able to see my pointer here. So this is a plot of two major US programs, two US welfare programs. I suppose in particular food stamps might be the most familiar, but AFTC was a program in place prior to the 1996 welfare reform, which we will study extensively in this paper. So AFTC, aid for families with dependent children. So here's a mapping from the annual income of a household to the amount of benefits that households can receive. So of course, this is a downward sloping, these are downward sloping lines. Consider the blue line, which is a single parent with one child. So this is from 1995, right before the reform that we will be studying. So the poverty line is around $10,000. So suppose you're very low income, single mother making $5,000, you receive substantial supplementation to your income through the AFDC program of around $120. Now suppose that you meet a potential partner. Depending on how the distribution of potential partners you could draw on, you may face very complex trade-offs. For example, by marrying somebody who has a zero income, you indeed may be eligible for slightly higher benefits, of course, though you will need you end up possibly sharing some of the payments with your partner. But suppose instead you match with somebody whose income is $5,000 like yours. So you're doubling your household income, suddenly you lose all of your eligibility. So this will be moving to this red dashed line. So the design of welfare programs might vary. So for example, the food stamps has much more space between these lines. And so thinking about what type of incentives or costs the relationship between payments and household status or marital status can be very relevant. So I'll get more concrete. So what we do is we study a particular reform to the US welfare system. So in 1996, a time limit was imposed on eligibility for this AFTC payment. That means that household could only receive payments for up to 5 years on average. I'll give you more details soon. We'll study this reform. First, we'll look at the data, and obviously we're not the first people to do that. There's been work showing that time limits affected the participation, the imposition of time limits affected the participation in this program. And we'll study also marital status choices, but in particular the decision to form or to walk out of a two-headed household, so, in particular through the marital status of the respondent. So we'll see that the reforms appears to influence behavior on many margins. And so we will use these margins to motivate the development, the building and estimating a model that both thinks about what type of dynamic incentives might be at play when you face time limits and how long you can be on welfare for. But also sort of more generally to also think about how the cutting down welfare eligibility might affect formation of household, dissolution of households. Once we have this model, then we can use its estimates to study how household structure can interact with the social safety net. So that's a basic outline. Please feel free to jump in at any point. So I'll give you a bit more details now about this reform. It's the Personal Reconciliation and Work Opportunity, no, Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. It took me a while to memorize the acronym. It was signed by Bill Clinton in August of 1996. It was meant at the time, quote, to end welfare as we know it, unquote. And the time-limited nature of the social safety net was the main, but not only component of the reform. What did this mean? So the AFTC program that you saw earlier kept a similar schedule that I showed you. But now, instead of being accessible to any household with a dependent child, was only accessible to household with a dependent child for up to 5 years, or at least the federal government would only allow states to pay up to 5 years. If states wanted to be more generous or less generous, they had the freedom to do so. So this means that potentially, even if you have one child, potentially you see your years of eligibility going from 18 to 5. And because these 5 years cannot be reinstated, if you have additional children, that's actually a lower bound of how strict this rule might have been. Of course, how binding it is or it isn't is a question that we're hoping also to understand with this exercise. There was some flexibility in how states decided to implement the rules, both in terms of how strict they were. Some states imposed the limits of just 21 months or 2 years, so extremely likely to bind. There was also some time variation, which we'll exploit in the adoption. Some states preceded the federal government and others were slow at implementing it. So I'll give you sort of super quick outline, but I'll start with the data and give you some reduced form evidence, some of which confirms what's already been shown in the literature. But then I'll jump into the model, hopefully not spend too much time on the estimation so that we can talk about the simulations and the results, because that's mostly new also.
Sorry, can I ask a clarification question?
Yeah.
Does the reform or do the rules differentiate between marriage and cohabitation? Because I could cohabitate, not tell anyone that I am with someone else and get the higher benefit.
Yeah, that's very important. So it's quite nuanced, and in fact, Robert Moffett just published a paper a couple of years ago documenting the different state level rules, because there is variation. In general, if you are married or if you are cohabiting with the father of the biological father of the dependent child, then you're treated as married or as a two-headed married couple for the purposes of welfare. So here we were faced with a question of how we would treat people who were married, who were living together but were not married. So it seems that empirically, if you look particular data from the 90s and people's, in particular in sociology, they've studied data from the CEPR exactly on this question. It's actually quite rare to cohabit with the father of your children and not be married in the long run. And so for this analysis, when we say married, when we say married, we will mean you answer married to the question, what's your marital status in the CEPR? And that for sure is an approximation in some cases, but we feel it's a less bad approximation than doing the opposite. And if there's time, I'll show you in the estimates where that shows up, because it has some, I think it has some implications for how high certain parameters end up being. One parameter ends up being. Thanks, Michela. This was very useful to clarify. All right, so in terms of data, in the interest of time, I will show you results from the CEPR, which is also the Survey of Income and Program Participation is what we use for the estimation, but we've done robustness checks with the CPS. So in the paper, the analysis is done in parallel also on the CPS. What's nice about the CEPR is that you have a lot of information about what program, you can see it in its name, what welfare programs people are participating in. Because low skill or some non-college graduates are much more likely to be on welfare, that's the population that we will focus on. In fact, we've done robustness where we check what happens with the college graduates, and we don't see the same patterns arising outside of the welfare use, which is somewhat reassuring. So let me give you an intuition for the basic strategy that we're going to use for in this reduced form part, and also just to tell you what's coming later. When we estimate the model, we will replicate this difference in difference estimates with a simulated model to verify that indeed the model bears the same predictions. So this idea comes from a paper by Grogor and Mikolopoulos in 2003 that was studying time limits in the state of Florida in a pilot program. So here we plot the age of a youngest child on the vertical axis and the years of potential support. Sorry, this is the vertical axis, the years of potential support, and horizontal, the age of the youngest child. Prior to the reform, or in states that end up coming up with their own funds to cover households, there's a one-to-one mapping between the years of potential support and the age of your youngest child, at least in terms of your expectations. And this is, assuming that you don't have an additional child, which could further increase your access to payments. Now, once a reform is imposed, let's see the example of Illinois, which is, I guess, the state where I'm talking to you from, but also the state that followed the 5-year rule very closely. So once the reform is passed, if your youngest child is age 13 or above, time limits don't really affect your expectations about how many years of welfare you have, because you only had 5 years left anyways, in which you could hope to receive benefits. Say if you're in Ohio, which is an even stricter state, that having a 13-year-old still means you see your benefits cut. So our basic strategy, following Groger and Michalopoulos, but you applying it across states and exploiting also a little bit the time variation in implementation of the reform, is to compare households that have slightly younger or younger or older, and we also do exercises where we drop the very young kids because we presume that those might respond to reforms in their own way. So the households with older or younger children before and after the reform. That's the basic idea. So another exercise that we can do is states like Massachusetts, for example, have a even stricter rule than just time limits, because in addition to a 5-year time limit, they also tell you you cannot use welfare for more than 2 years every 5. And so that adds an additional constraint on household behavior that we can account for. So to be more specific, basically we build a variable that captures whether you're exposed to time limits in expectation or not, depending on what state you live in and how young your child is. So this is just a formalization of what I just said. So for instance, a parent of a 13-year-old might be exposed in some states and not exposed in others. So then we can keep year and state fixed effects. So do analysis where we can look inside a state and within a year, comparing households with younger and older children, where younger and older depends on the rules of the state. Let me give you a quick overview of what we find. So consistent with the literature, we find this big decline in the participation in this AFDC 10F program. It changes its names, but otherwise maintains its characteristics. It's just after the reform, you see a cut. You are subject to time limit, where the clock obviously starts ticking in 1996. So potentially you could use the benefits. You cannot have run out of them early on, but you may decide that you want to keep your eligibility for the future in case in the future your offer wage is too low relative to say what it is today. Or at least that's an interpretation. This is how a dynamic model that we build would suggest. We see a pretty substantial decline in welfare use, so particularly for single women. This is a 50% reduction. Of course, conditioning on marital status might be a problem. That's why we want a model that accounts for the selection into being single. The decrease in welfare use is also associated with a substantial increase, but only for single women in employment. The time pattern of this is also very interesting because we see a pretty sharp decline relatively quickly. So these are quarterly estimates, so just interacting the exposed variable with a quarterly dummy. So within a year of the reform, households, you see these are for on average, so for both single and married households already exhibit a reduction in welfare use, even though in no state, of course, the limit is that low. So this is suggestive of the fact, suggests that households are forward-looking and choose to reduce their welfare use even before being cut out of welfare. The other outcome that we examine is household structure, and in particular, we observe a decrease in the probability of being divorced. And the estimates in the CIP are the largest. In the CPS, they will be quite a bit smaller. So, but the pattern is significant and consistent across the two surveys. So again, one possible interpretation, and something we want to look at in the model, is that seeing your eligibility cut for a single woman reduces the appeal of being single. So in sum, we're interested in a model that can allow us to account for this across the board decline in welfare use for singles and married people. Employment increases, particularly for single women, and this decline in divorce. We've also looked at marriage and fertility, and we see no particular changes there. So let me give you a hopefully brief, a Friday night appropriate summary of the model. But this is a life cycle setup where people choose, and I'll give you more details about how that happens, whether marriage or to be married or to be divorced. They can choose whether, given the rules, whether to participate in the welfare system. in this particular welfare payments, they choose whether the woman works or not. And then they can save and they can allocate private consumption if they're married between the spouses. What we're interested in is also thinking about how this change in eligibility might affect men and women within the household. So women, because they see their benefits, especially as single, as being cut, and men potentially through an intra-household allocation mechanism. These choices are made in an environment where you can, as I choose to be on some programs, while other programs are given to you as a function of your characteristics, so your income and your assets. There's stochastic wages. You cannot borrow, but you can save. You participate in a marriage market where you can draw from the distribution of singles in the economy, and that's estimated from the data. So we don't solve for the full equilibrium in the marriage market. Given the complexity of the model, that would be not possible. And then fertility is a stochastic process, but you can influence your fertility status by changing your marital status, because the probability of arrival of children depends on your fertility. So let me show you now where the time limit comes in. So actually, I should add this because this is a thing that we've been adding and removing. But so the features that I'm gonna wear headphones because I think my children are beating each other up outside the door, and I hope you guys are not seeing it too loudly. So how much benefit you can receive is a function of whether or not you have children, what your wages are multiplied with a dummy for whether or not you're employed, and then if you're married, also your spouse's income. So this is prior to the reform. Nothing else determines your welfare use. Oh, and yeah, what I meant to add is now we also have an asset test, which is in place. It turns out that it doesn't matter because only very low asset people end up exposed to choosing to participate. After the reform is implemented, another state variable that you need to keep track of is how long you've been receiving welfare payments, because if you exceed the time limit, then your welfare payments would go down to zero. I'll tell you a bit about now how the model works in terms of what decisions are made by whom. Once for a given period, your marital status has been determined. So we'll think about people who start will be for that period in the model acting as a single, have chosen to be a single woman. So if you're a single woman for that period, you can choose your consumption, whether or not to work, and whether or not to claim benefits. You can evaluate marital offers as they arrive, and so this will be an expectation for next period, because for this period you've made this choice. And so with some probability, every period you can meet a potential partner, and jointly you will decide whether to marry or not. You may or may not have children, and so a newborn arrives stochastically. So this is the value function for all of this, but I think it's probably more sensible to say it in words. But let me show you. For a single man, the problem is a little bit easier because men always work. So they receive in this model, they receive an exogenous stochastic level of income, which includes zero. So they may receive actually an unemployment shock, but their employment is not a choice. And they can't, because they don't have dependent children, they can't participate in the FTC 10F program. So they end up choosing their consumption, but their consumption choices are influenced by the fact that they know they might meet a partner in the future, and so their savings decision will be really influenced by that. So that's reflected in the value function. Last, say you've chosen to be a part of a couple for this period, you will choose consumption, employment, and again, welfare participation. Choices in the household will be done efficiently in a ex-post efficient way in a collective model with limited commitment. That means that we allow changes in your value as a single to influence your intra-household allocation. So for example, changes in the welfare, generosity of welfare. Again, you may have a newborn, and for this period, of course, you've chosen to be married by how we're writing it up, but you anticipate that next period you might also end up choosing to divorce. So there's some expectations for the future where if you don't divorce, you're back to the same problem, or you might choose to divorce and then you have a singles problem. So just a couple more slides to tell you how people choose to go from one type of problem to another. So what determines these transitions across marital states, which is quite important because it's going to determine all the selection of who ends up being single and therefore more likely to be on welfare. So single people meet a potential match every year with probability lambda. And this match is drawn from a distribution, which in the estimation is going to be empirical. It will come from the data. So it means men will come with a certain level of assets and a certain level of income, and women also with a certain number of, a certain age of youngest child and a certain welfare eligibility. And then they, when you meet somebody, you also draw a match quality. And that could be positive or negative. If it's positive, you're more likely to be happy to marry each other. If it's negative, much less likely. So given these draws, you can compute your value as married and your value as single for each spouse or each person. And you will marry if there exists a feasible way to allocate consumption. So this is what theta is just a Pareto weight in the household allocation problem, such that both people prefer being married than single. And then typically there's going to be actually a continuum of these possible ways to allocate consumption because they're search frictions. And so people will play Nash bargaining to determine what the initial Pareto weight is. They can go on as married, and now match quality evolves in the real world and in the model. And so people might find themselves in situations where the match quality has deteriorated, and so they might prefer being single than being married. Or other forces might have happened, such as income shock, that would prefer to have them walk out than stay. And so if there exists no feasible way to allocate consumption such that both people continue preferring being married than single, then the couple will split up. If instead such an allocation exists, it's just not the present allocation, then the household will renegotiate the way in which consumption is allocated. So for all purposes in this model, that means if you're married and welfare becomes less generous, it might be that the inter-household allocation ends up favoring the man a little bit more. And that's what the model predicts. So in terms of magnitude, it's not end up going to be that large. I guess this is probably the last this sort of model description slide. We have the stochastic fertility process, which governs the arrival of new children, and that's a function. It's a transition matrix from the age of your youngest child, which is a state variable, and that probability of having a newborn depends also on the woman's age and on her marital status. Again, we'll get this from the data. So married women will end up having particularly early on in life, a higher chance of experiencing the arrival of a newborn. This match quality, these will all be things that we end up estimating, evolves as a random walk. And then also the earnings and wage process. So earnings could be zero either by choice or if you're a man because of an employment shock. And then if you do work, your wage is a function of your age plus a stochastic component, which also evolves as a random walk. So these shocks are persistent. And we estimate those from the data.
Alessandra,
Barbara,
if I can just ask a qualification. So
please.
You don't allow, for example, the wage process to depend on actual labor market experience. It's just like potential experience with age.
Yeah,
because that would matter for the timing of this kind of 5 years allocation, when it's best to take it, or whether you can, whether, for example, career breaks are penalized by earnings.
Yeah, so we thought about this. We face a constraint in terms of what type of state variable, particularly sort of continuous one, we want to carry through. And because these are low-skilled women, given recent evidence on returns to experience among low-skilled workers, we ended up thinking that the experience angle, and actually there's been quite a bit of evidence even related to welfare participation, so work by Blundell and co-authors and David Card and co-authors, suggesting that these experience effects for the welfare for population that's likely to participate in welfare are not that large. But I agree that could be quite an interesting angle, possibly for programs that target slightly higher productivity participants, for example. But yeah, so this is useful to emphasize. So experience is not a state variable here. All right, so I'll tell you about the estimation. Of course, please interrupt me. Also, I think it helps keeping people engaged at this time of the day. So please jump in at any point. I'll tell you somewhat, hopefully briefly, how we estimate the model. So we do this in multiple steps. We do fix some parameters exogenously, and these will be primarily the risk aversion, which is set to 1.5, the extent of economies of scale in the household, in the marriage, and the cost of childcare and the discount factor. Some parameters we can estimate directly from the data, particularly the wage and employment processes. We can do a selection correction that to estimate those directly from the data, the fertility process, and the distribution of singles. It means in the end, we're left with a relatively parsimonious set of parameters that we can estimate. It's 10 parameters, which are specific to this model. They pertain to the cost of working, the cost of being, the utility cost of being on welfare, which may end up being important to explain why some people who are eligible for welfare don't claim it, particularly prior to the reform. After the reform, there may be dynamic consideration, but in a model like this, before the reform, you should want to participate unless there exist barriers. And there's a vast literature in public economics pointing at stigma as an important source of barrier towards welfare use. And then the distribution of the match quality parameter and the probability time age evolution of the probability of meeting a spouse. We'll estimate these parameters by the method of simulated moments, and we will target moments from the CEP. So we will simulate the CEP with our data, meaning these 4-year panels. And we will match moments from pre-reform for the 1960 birth, lifetime moments for this 1960 birth cohort, which is the one that's more likely to be affected by the reform. In terms of parametrization, so you know what the parameters that we have will look like. Utility is a constant relative risk aversion, but the employment status, which is P, your participation in the labor market choice, will affect your marginal utility of consumption. So psi is the cost of working, which is allowed to vary with marital status and the presence of children. Then there is just an additive cost of being on welfare, which is marked as eta. Probabilities of meeting a partner are quadratic, and then match quality evolves as it's random walk, as I mentioned earlier, but we'll have a separate variance for the initial draw and for the updates. And so these will all be estimated empirically. So we target these life cycle moments, in particular, the lifetime evolution of the probability of marriage, which, as you might imagine, given the parameters that we're interested in, is very informative of how over the life cycle, the probability of meeting a partner might evolve. And then we match the probability of divorce over the life cycle. And again, this helps us quite a bit with trying to pin down these different variances. So the evolution of match quality at the beginning of the marriage relative to later on. And then we target the employment probabilities for women of different demographic characteristics, so mothers, non-mothers, and then married versus single. And there's corresponding parameters for cost of work for these groups. And then we have one cost of the cost of participating in welfare, and that's obviously going to be informed by the fraction of people who claim welfare on average. So single women in pre-reform time are almost 40%, almost a 40% probability of claiming AFTC. This is, remember, for the non-college graduate population. So this was at the time a very popular program. Among married couples, there's still non-negligible use, but it's less than 4%. So these are the mapping between the target and what the data and what the moment and the model suggests. Parameter estimates are not I mean, I guess what's interesting about parameter estimates is that the cost of working is pretty high. So this is tantamount to basically the fraction of your consumption you're left with once you work. And so to follow up on Michela's question, I think what's interesting is we find the cost of working for single women without children to be very high. And I think part of the reason is we don't characterize maybe the budget constraint of these women super well, because some of them might have partners that support them or even parents and so on. Of course, they're also, because they don't have children, they're not so central to the model, but they are important because they will feed into the decisions. But I've seen other papers, in fact, run into similar problems. And so that's my diagnosis. That's where I think this decision kicks in. And then another thing that's quite interesting is that the cost of being on welfare ends up being positive, not enormous, but quite large. So you have to, so that's going to influence decisions to be on welfare. And this will then allow us to match these high, but not super high, given the low income for this population, choice to be on welfare as a single mother. Okay, so with these estimates, I can now, in the last part of the talk, tell you about what we do with them, which I think is mostly somewhat new and hopefully interesting. So first of all, we want to think about the role of the welfare reform. And so what we can do is, because we've estimated the model on the pre-reform data, we can now simulate the introduction of time limits and see what our model predicts should happen, both in terms of what we can see in the data, and that will be for validation, but after that, more interestingly, also for things that in the data we actually could not see. So, and we can do that in two ways. So the first thing is we can think about the transition. So it means simulate a cohort prior to the reform and then shock people with the arrival of this time limit. And that's what we can use then for the differences in difference estimates. What we could not see in the data are long-term responses, meaning what would happen for people who are exposed to time limits in the long run. And how do they adjust to the presence of these limits. And so when I talk about banking here, what I mean is something that we want to look at quite closely is what determines people's choice to not claim welfare even though they may be eligible. That's what in this sort of how the literature has been calling this choice. So we want to understand how large this force is, and then later on we will study how that interacts with the marriage option. All right, so these are the differences that you saw earlier on the annual CPS data. And so as you can see, by and large, we are in this in the ballpark of what I showed you earlier. Although I think we overshoot a bit with the response of the married people, but we're otherwise in the 95% confidence interval of these differences in differences. So in the short run, it looks like people are responding in the transition as we see them respond in the data. Now we can look, yeah, Michela, yes.
So in this different diff, you're treating the treatment as a binary variable, while in reality there is treatment intensity. Are you able to match that with the model?
That's interesting. We have some estimates of that empirically. It's quite noisy in the sense that we do see that welfare participation drop is strongest for mothers of very young children, just as we would expect. So I know that qualitatively that's correct. I don't know if quantitatively it is, and maybe I should have a picture of that, but I'll show you quantitatively at least the time evolution. So I think we're quite close in terms of characterizing how households respond. So so I'd expect that would allow us to match that as well, but it's an important point. And when it comes to employment, it's a lot more muddled even in the data, because age of your youngest child might affect your ability to work, and so on, which is why in some robustness checks we drop the mothers of the very young children. In the model, there's some childcare costs, so that can capture that, but it might not capture it fully. We try to characterize that carefully. Okay, so now let's think a bit about how these the sort of policy functions in the models look like that can allow us to explain what we see in the data. So the first question that one might have looking at this reform, which is actually not very easily answered by the data, even by more systematic studies of administrative data that have been carried out, is how likely is it that a 5-year limit ends up being binding? For example, it's possible that given the nature of the persistency of shocks and so on, and you don't need 5 years of welfare. Most women don't need 5 years of welfare, and so the reform is immaterial. So what we can look at in our model is with the AFTC or without limit or with time limit, what's the distribution of lifetime use of welfare. And obviously for that you would need, now that it's been several decades from the data, one would need basically really good administrative sources, which are not compiled in order to assess this. And in fact, even for us sort of finding data on how long somebody has been on welfare for, nor the SIP nor the PSID gives you that information in a clear fashion. So, so as you can see, prior to the reform, about 10% of all women, so not mothers, of all women in their life, will end up using welfare for more than 6 years. So this means the reform is likely to bind for mothers, not to a tremendous extent, but to a non-negligible extent. So that means once the 5-year limit is introduced, you will expect some bunching at 5 years. What's interesting is, though, this amount of bunching doesn't correspond to the sum between the 5-year red line, the pre-reform fraction of people who are using welfare for 5 and 6 years. So, and the reason for that will be this banking notion. So the notion that people will end up holding on to their benefit in expectation that in the future they might need them, because expecting that they might experience low productivity shocks. Obviously exposed, in some cases these productivity shocks do materialize, but in other cases they don't, and so you don't end up using all the welfare eligibility that you have. We see that maybe even better when we compare the fraction of women, depending on the age of their youngest child, that have used 5 years of welfare. So prior to the reform, about 20% of the mothers of 17-year-olds in our model, this is all from the model, have used the 5 years of welfare. That fraction is around 14% once the reform kicks in. So basically, the fraction of women who use at least 5 years of benefit after the reform is at age 17 is equal to the fraction of women prior to the reform who use that same amount of benefit at age 7 of their youngest child. So people are holding on to, are refraining from using welfare. Obviously, it's going to be very interesting at the end to figure out how much they are hurt by this. So so in the light of this banking behavior, then the model can replicate, and so this will be the model, the red line, and black the data, can replicate the decline in welfare use that I also showed you earlier on in the reduced form part. So the fact that right away, once the reform kicks in particular, starting the second year, you see a drop in welfare use. If we didn't allow people to be forward-looking, so we can simulate the model assuming that people don't know that the time limits are in place, we wouldn't see such a decline early on, because the restrictions would kick in only once you have run out of your benefits, so not early on. So who are the women who end up cutting their welfare use, decreasing their welfare use? We can examine changes in welfare use and employment by productivity, which would be much harder, almost impossible to do in the data, given that with low employment rates, you actually don't know what the potential earnings of the women who choose to not participate or choose to not work would look like. And so we see that it is the bottom quintile of the ability of the potential income distribution that ends up dropping its welfare use the most. This is on average, so this is throughout the entire, this is lifetime, so not just early on, but also this is a comparison that accounts both for the people who find the welfare to be binding and those who decide to preemptively stop using. welfare. And so even though they decrease their welfare use and they start increasing their employment, we have to keep in mind that average income for this bottom quintile, I think, is in the order of $11,000 a year. So these are really low income workers. Large chunk of this effect is anticipatory. So is banking. That means takes place among people who still have at least 5 years of, at least 1 year of welfare left. So they have not used their entire 5-year bank. And so we can estimate that by conditioning on having at least 5 years of welfare once the time limits kick in. So hold the composition fixed and compare how much welfare use takes place. And you see almost 10 percentage points decline in welfare use in this very low income population, even when their benefits are there for them. So what's the role now of having thought about incorporating marriage decision into how the welfare reform affects people? So that's going to be what the next set of counterfactuals tries to speak to. And in particular, we're going to do two types of counterfactuals. In one, we shut down the marriage market, the marriage option entirely. And this is actually quite similar to what a significant fraction of the models in this literature do. So they just assume that women are single. We can still select the women who are married. So we can focus on the same women who would marry. So we can account for the selection, which would be tantamount sort of randomly assigning marriage to the same women. So, and just look at the endogenous response, which has to do with your anticipation of being married in the future and how that affects how the cutting welfare benefits affects you. And so this is what these pictures do. So let me try to explain them, and I think this is the one sort of small print, the only small print picture, hopefully, and then we move on to others with bigger font. But so this picture just plots the difference in welfare use between time limits and no time limits. So by how much welfare use is decreased. And so as you can see for the bottom quintile, this is a 40% number that we saw earlier on average for all women. And blue is the 20 percentage points decline for the women who already has some welfare, still have some welfare benefits left that they can use. So this will be an entirely anticipatory effect. And so these are the magnitudes in our main model, and then the red and the green are the magnitudes in a model where we ignore marriage, or in particular where these women don't have expectation that they can marry in the future. So as you can see, if you don't expect to marry in the future, you respond twice as much to the presence of time limits, or to a cut basically in future benefits eligibility. And so that suggests that the prospect of potentially marrying might provide some insurance to these women. Remember, in the blue line and the red line are estimated in a model that matches the marriage rates for the 1960 birth cohort. So of course, nowadays, marriage probabilities have dropped significantly compared to that cohort. And so single mothers are much more exposed to the costs of reduced welfare benefits. And we'll quantify that in a few slides. So that the big increase in welfare, so the big drop in welfare use is similarly associated with a big increase in employment, which is much larger again if you don't expect you can be married. So to clarify, if you expect to be married, you don't think you'll need to bank your benefits, and so you respond substantially less. On the contrary, let's think about the divorce option, and now focus on married women. So if you are married and you expect to be married forever, and we see in the data that these women reduce their welfare use, well, you reduce much less because, of course, being married doesn't expose you as much to the potential need of having to go on welfare, and in fact, your eligibility is typically lower, and so you respond quite less. So modeling these different features in the marriage market helps you understand, helps you characterize exactly more closely what the expectations of these participants might have been. All right, so in the last, I don't know, should I leave some time at the end, Barbara? I think I can finish in 5, if that's, okay. Yeah, so I'll tell you a bit, sort of the last bit that we want to think about is, now that we've seen that benefits are cut, we want to know how costly this is for welfare participants. Of course, the government is saving quite a bit of money by cutting benefits. We see that at least 10% of participants would end up using fewer benefits than counterfactually. And so we want to account for whether to this government saving as well in our welfare calculations. So we want to basically attempt to consider the revenue neutral policies. So how do we implement that? So we compute the government saving from time limits. We compute what level of a negative payroll tax will be paid back to agents in our model to keep the government's budget still balanced. So that means you can have no time limits and no tax cut, or time limits and a tax cut. And we can think of 2 different ways to redistribute. One is to only pay back the women, which are the participants in our model. Or you can think about paying back both the men and the women. That would mean, so the model is typically simulated for women in the estimation, but we now can also simulate the men and see how they are affected by these time limits. And we should expect that on the one hand, them to be positively affected by time limits if they have more say in household decisions, if they get more consumption out of their marriage because their wives have a worse outside option. So that's one angle. But on the other angle, of course, they don't get the benefits when they're married. And so in both cases might matter. It's an empirical, it's going to be empirical what ends up happening. So once we've computed this negative payroll tax, we can compare the time limits and tax cut benefit to the no tax cut, no time limit, and compute what fraction of consumption would make participants, men or women, indifferent between being in one regime or the other one. So let's start first by thinking about women. So first of all, just by benchmark, let's think about not having a revenue neutrality. So if we ignore the tax cut and the savings from the government, women would pay 0.74% of their lifetime consumption, so the consumption every year of their life, to avoid time limits. This tells us that time limits is actually very costly because, for example, estimates of the value of a program like disability insurance say it's 1%. And here is 0.74, but remember, this is just a 5-year limit, not the entire program, but just the fact that you are facing this, this constraint. Once you account for the government saving, which means once you rebate the government savings back to women, and that's by reducing taxes by 0.38%, you still see that these women would give up 0.54% of their lifetime consumption. So 0.5% just to avoid time limits, even in a state, even if they get the government savings back in the form of lower taxes. Of course, risk aversion is very important here. You get the benefits when your income and consumption are low, and you get the tax cut when you get more money from the tax cut when your income is high. What happens if we suppress, so this first line is the one you just saw, but let's think about what happens when you suppress the marriage market, the marriage option. So in the model without marriage, how big would the cost of cutting benefit would be? So of course the government savings are bigger, so the tax rebate is higher, it's almost 1%. But also the probability that you will run out of benefit, and so the utility cost of time limits is higher, and so it's actually 46% higher, so a pretty significant increase, and that means that you'd give up 0.8% of your lifetime consumption to avoid time limits. So modeling marriage, so having marriage as an option, somehow shields these welfare participants from the cost of the benefits cut. And here's when I mentioned a counterfactual where we, instead of shutting down marriage entirely, we just reduce the probability of meeting a partner so that the lifetime probability of marriage goes down by 10 percentage points, which reflects by how much marriage probability has dropped between the 1960 cohort that we're estimating and my cohort, the 1980 birth cohort. And so that just a 10% declines in the probability of marriage raises the cost consumption equivalent basically halfway between having the full marriage market option of the 1960 cohort and not having no marriage at all. So the returns to the marriage market are very convex. And the women in the present generation might be even more exposed to the cost of welfare reform than the initial participants. Last thing I want to show you is what happens to the men. I mean, of course, men are also paying the taxes, so we want to consider instead the case in which we're computing the welfare, the government of the revenue neutral tax cut also being rebated back to the men. So first consider the revenue neutral case. So as we've seen, it's costly for women to have time limits. It turns out that men are by and large indifferent because they get this slightly higher share of household consumption, but they don't get any possibility of accessing welfare through marriage with their spouse. And so in the absence of a tax cap, they don't care about whether benefits are slashed or not. But once you account for the tax savings, and so you rebate a revenue neutral tax to both men and women. So that's going to be 0.11% once you give it to both men and women. Women continue obviously greatly prefer not having time limits, but now men prefer the time limits. So this now becomes a bit of a political economy question, whether time limits are a desirable policy or not. On average, it's still very costly, but now you have half the people in expectation. And this is not really about gender, it's more about who's gonna end up having custody of children and therefore be more likely to claim welfare when single. In our model, it goes along gender lines, but of course, that just reflects empirically the fact that that's what we see happen much more often in the data. So in the interest of time, we also thought about other welfare reforms, and in particular, we thought if instead of time limits, you cut the generosity of welfare and achieve the same tax cut, what do people prefer? And our simulations say that cutting the generosity of the welfare is preferable to time limits because time limits provides you insurance in the state of the world where your productivity is low in the long run. And so yeah, these are the main results. So I'll conclude briefly saying that time limits are costly and particularly affect strongly the lowest quintile of productivity. And marriage and divorce or household structure in general mediate the impact of time limits, and more generally can possibly mediate the impact of other welfare reforms, especially for these lowest quintiles of the lowest productivity or sort of lowest potential income households. Some of that works through expectations, so it's important to model expectations carefully. So as single-headed homes become more common empirically in society, then the cost of welfare reforms that cut the benefits might raise dramatically. And that's my conclusion here, but obviously I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Alessandra, for your presentation. Happy to take questions.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Thanks very much, Alessandra, for this super interesting talk. It's really actually, one would have not imagined that like a reform, under Clinton would have harmed, such, this low income group. Is actually super interesting. But I thought one interesting dimension, which I thought it would, perhaps you can shed a little bit of light on, but obviously an important metric would be the children's well-being. And in particular, because of the banking effect, and given the fact that investment in children might be particularly, as we know, might have very high returns at early times, or lack of resources at very early ages might be particularly harmful. The idea that these women might, sort of not rely on welfare in expectation of being hit by a negative income shock later on in life might have very long and persistent effects on the children. So I thought perhaps I don't know whether you would be able to show that effect in terms of age of children as well. So in terms of effects on labor supply and and welfare received. That's the one, right?
Wait, so I think what you're saying is super important and very interesting. I mean, in this model, I didn't go into the details of what children do, but basically there's an equivalent scale. So some of the consumption of the mother or of the parents goes to the child. So, and so that's sort of uniform across ages. The welfare of the child and the welfare of the parents is very closely tied, particularly actually of the mother, because in case of divorce, the children stay with the mother. And so for sure, as you can see, it is not the case that the drop in the banking behavior or the decline in the propensity to use welfare acts differently. So even the mothers of very young children respond in a model like this. Of course, in a model where, say, the mothers anticipate that it's costly for the child to not have high levels of consumption early on, for example, they may respond somewhat less. But I do think, I think it would be very interesting. In fact, I mean, we've been thinking a bit about this. What would be very good is have good data about siblings, because I think also what this would imply is that birth order is going to be quite important. Because if you're the first child, your parents are more unlikely to have run out of benefit. But if you have in later birth orders, the chances that you lose access, or the chances that the household opts to bank, should be even higher. So yeah, that's an extremely interesting question, and just an additional reason why this policy might be problematic.
Still related to. Oh, sorry,
Thanks,
Marco.
No, it's okay.
Still related to children. I mean, exactly as one would have expected. I mean, children lose out here because they would end up having more likely to have a working mother, so there might be less investment in their children, lower family level consumption, but at the same time they're more likely to have their parents staying married, so there can be investment from the father.
And we don't know, and I know that there's some attempts now to quantify the value. I mean, this has been a long-standing question, and even in economics there's been work starting from Melissa Tartary's and thesis and John Gruber, but now more recently Will Dobby, I think, and others are thinking about the role of fathers and of household dissolution. I think is obviously an extremely important question. I don't think that at the moment we have strong evidence that pushing people to stay together when they would counterfactually split up benefits children. At least I would say the conclusion from the papers that I've seen are not pointing strongly in that direction. But I agree that there's trade-offs here that one would want to think about when thinking about children's welfare.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, whether the person initiating the divorce, for example, the mother, does it like according to her own preferences or to the sort of child welfare. I mean,
yeah,
it could be,
also.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Barbara.
Any more questions from the floor?
Yes. Hi. Thank you for the great talk. So the model is calibrated based on 1960 data, as you said, and the model assumes that men always work, and maybe that was a reasonable approximation for 1960, but nowadays it might not be such a good approximation anymore, especially because these men will be the men in the lower tail of the distribution, where non-employment is higher. So how difficult would it be to allow for men to choose their labor supply decisions also? If it's too difficult for married men, then how about just for single men? Right, and if there's this possibility that men do not work, then the cost of the reform will be higher for men also, I would believe. So would it be possible to compute some back of the envelope type of cost measures for when men don't work? It's possible that men don't work.
So that's a great question, and I think of course it's an important approximation. One thing that I should clarify: it's still certainly the case that we're making a strong approximation by by not allowing employment to be a choice. We do, however, as I mentioned, so both allow for the possibility of an unemployment shock, so income to draw down to zero. And then also when we estimate the process of earnings, annual earnings, that process accounts for any unemployment spell that can take place during the year. So we do try to characterize the budget constraint of the households exogenously for sure. So that's potentially problematic because there's not that margin of response. In terms of whether, I think this matters in general, whether it matters a lot for this model, we felt that it wasn't so central, given that we do not see employment effects of time limits on women when they're married. We don't see them on men either. So we don't see them. It doesn't seem that during marriage, because I guess array of factors, possibly the main one is tied to what I showed you earlier, which is that welfare use is not that common, and expectation of within marriage to run out of welfare are not that high. That margin does not seem an important one of adjustment. But yeah, that's I guess the justification. But I agree that possibly even when you think about other programs that are more likely to target couples, or where men are more likely to participate. I mean, another change is over time we'll see also possibly more custodial fathers, although again that's not that common. And so then the approximation that it's only women who get welfare as single mothers will become stronger. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think we should probably wrap up by now, unless there is any other quick question. So we should thank Alessandra very much for the very nice presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for everybody. And yes, let's hope to do this in person next year.
Thanks a lot to the organizers.